He sent me just 2 sentences on my 69th birthday, and in that moment, he unknowingly walked away from a $30 million fortune. This isn't just a story about money, it's about betrayal, respect, and a father's final stand. I want you to imagine that night with me, because I remember it so vividly, it's etched into my bones. My house, a sprawling estate in the green hills of Connecticut, stood silent against the autumn wind. Normally, silence in this home was a treasure, a sign that all the chaos of the world had been kept firmly outside. Thick walls, insulated windows, carefully curated surroundings. This home was built as both fortress and sanctuary, a place where I could rest after decades of hard labor building my empire from nothing but a dusty workshop and an unrelenting dream. But on this night, my 69th birthday, the silence was different. It was not peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed into my chest with the weight of all the things unsaid and undone. It was the sound of absence, the absence of a son who once adored me, and a daughter-in-law whose smile I had never trusted. I sat in my leather armchair, the one Anna used to tease me about, saying it made me look like a judge preparing to sentence the world. Anna, my late wife, my anchor, my light, was gone now, and the house felt like a museum of ghosts. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hall, each sound carving seconds off a day that had passed with no phone call, no visit, not even a message from Leo, my only son. I glanced at the polished oak table beside me, where my phone lay face down, silent and still. I had picked it up more times than I could count, thumb hovering over his name, heart aching with both hope and dread. I told myself he was busy. I told myself Chloe, his wife, was likely organizing one of her glittering galas, playing the role of society darling. But deep down, I knew these were excuses I whispered to myself to soften the truth. Because a son doesn't forget his father's birthday. Not unless he has learned that forgetting has no consequence. And my greatest mistake had been teaching him that there were no consequences for neglect, no boundaries on my love, no end to my giving. The silence seemed to play tricks on me, bringing back the sounds of a different time. I could almost hear Leo as a child, his laughter echoing from the staircase as he raced down in pajamas to surprise me with a handmade card. I could see Anna arranging fresh flowers on the mantel. On the mantel, her delicate touch filling the room with warmth. I could hear music, laughter, life, but those days were gone, replaced by polite, distant phone calls, empty holidays, and the hollow smiles of a son who had grown too comfortable with having everything handed to him. When Anna died, I had made a silent vow to pour every ounce of my energy into raising Leo right, into giving him the kind of life she would have wanted for him. I built him a world where he would never know the hunger, the exhaustion, the humiliation of scraping through life like I had in my early years. I gave him the best schools, the finest opportunities, every door open before he even knew how to knock. But in giving him everything, I now saw clearly I had taken away the one thing he truly needed. A reason to respect the man who had sacrificed for him. As the evening dragged on, the loneliness clawed at me. I wasn't looking for gifts or grand gestures. All I wanted was acknowledgement, a simple phone call, a moment of connection, something to remind me that I still mattered in his world. Finally, I picked up the phone, and with fingers that trembled more than I wanted to admit, I began typing. I erased and retyped the words several times, desperate not to sound needy, not to sound like a man begging for scraps of attention from his own child. At last, I settled on a simple message. Just wanted to say I love you both. Hope you're having a good week. I hit send before I could second-guess myself again. Relief washed over me for a moment, fragile but real. At least I had broken the silence. At least I had reached across the gulf that separated us. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt like a flame catching on dry wood. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were about to apologize for forgetting. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I picked up the phone, ready to forgive, ready to believe. But then I read the words glowing on the screen, and in an instant, the ground seemed to vanish beneath me. 2 sentences. We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The air left my lungs as if I had been punched in the chest. This wasn't a bad day. This wasn't the heat of anger. This was calculated, deliberate, final. It was a dismissal, not of an employee but of a father. My son had fired me from his life. And then, as if to twist the knife, a notification appeared. Chloe had liked the message. That simple tap, that casual acknowledgement, was the cruelest insult of all. She had turned my son into the kind of man who could sever ties with his father in the most sterile, heartless way possible, and she was proud of it. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor, but I barely noticed. My mind flooded with memories I couldn't hold back. The day he was born, the first time I held him and promised I'd give him the world. Teaching him to ride a bike on the driveway, steadying his wobbly handlebars as he laughed. The nights we stayed up late working on school projects together, the pride in his eyes when he showed me his graduation diploma. The boy who once told me he wanted to make me proud had vanished, replaced by a man who saw me only as a burden to be managed, an obstacle to his carefully curated life. And I knew in that moment that this wasn't just Leo speaking. It was Chloe's influence seeping into every word. She had always looked at me with that calculating smile, as though my fortune were a prize she had already won. And perhaps, in her mind, she had. But as I sat there in the suffocating silence of my home, something inside me hardened. For years I had excused the subtle slights, the missed visits, the cold politeness. I had told myself that love was patient, that if I just kept giving, they would come back to me. But love without respect is invisible. Kindness without boundaries is weakness. And that night I realized I had been complicit in my own erasure. I had allowed them to treat me this way by never demanding better, but no more. That night I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, a quiet, icy resolve settled into my bones. If Leo wanted space, I would give him space, more space than he could ever imagine. But it would not come free. The next morning, the sun rose as if nothing had changed, but I was no longer the same man who had sat helplessly in that armchair. I walked into my study, a room filled with the tangible reminders of a lifetime of labor and sacrifice. Awards, photographs, the framed blueprints of the company I had built with my own hands. I opened the drawer that contained my will and trust documents, and for the first time, I looked at them with clear, unclouded eyes. $30 million. That was the sum of my life's work, the fortune I had always intended for Leo to inherit. For years it had been unspoken but assumed. One day it would all be his, but now staring at those papers, I felt a power I hadn't felt in years. They thought my love was a weakness, my silence a sign of surrender. They thought they could dismiss me, like an old man past his usefulness. But they were wrong. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. His voice was surprised to hear from me on a Saturday, but when he heard the steel in mine, he knew this was no small matter. That afternoon, he sat across from me in my office as I laid everything out. "I want to make some changes," I said, my tone calm but firm. "Big ones." We combed through every clause, every beneficiary, every detail of my estate, and with each signature, with each stroke of the pen, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I redirected funds into charitable foundations, scholarships for children who reminded me of the boy I once was, hungry, determined, grateful for every opportunity. I set up trusts in Anna's name, honoring the woman who had loved selflessly and deserved a legacy of her own. And then, with deliberate precision, I began rewriting Leo's future. I didn't erase him entirely, not yet. This wasn't about vengeance in the heat of anger. This was about clarity. This was about teaching him, perhaps for the first time in his life, that actions have consequences. As the lawyer prepared to leave, he paused at the door, briefcase in hand, and asked gently, "Are you sure about this?" I looked past him at the vast, quiet house that had once been filled with laughter and nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I've been taken for granted long enough." But even as I spoke, I knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't only about documents and signatures. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about taking control of a story they thought they could write for me. They believed they had the power to cut me off, but what they didn't understand was that the true power lay not in walking away, but in what I would do next. The silence of that birthday night never really left me, but it transformed. In the days that followed, it hardened into something sharper, more purposeful, something I had not felt in years: resolve. My son and his wife thought they had dismissed me with 2 sentences and a smug little like, on a glowing screen, but they had underestimated the man who built an empire from sawdust, steel, and sleepless nights. They had mistaken kindness for weakness, silence for surrender, and patience for passivity. But I was not a weak man, and though I had been patient, though I had endured slights and cold shoulders for years, there comes a moment when patience evolves into clarity, and clarity demands action. I began with the will, the trust, the legal documents that had long promised them the life they took for granted. My lawyer returned to the estate the following week, and together we pored over every clause and line until every ounce of entitlement was stripped out. The 30 million that had once been destined to pad their luxurious lives was now restructured. Scholarships for hardworking students, charitable foundations in Anna's name, funds to rebuild community centers in towns that had been forgotten by time. As the pen scraped across the paper, I felt something inside me stir, something like justice, something like liberation. But I did not erase Leo entirely. No, that would have been too merciful. Instead, I left him a token portion, just enough to remind him of what he had lost, just enough for him to see the gaping hole where 30 million once stood. I wanted him to ask questions. I wanted him to feel the absence and wonder why. And then I waited. The waiting was not idle. I moved through the empty halls of my home, and though loneliness clung to me like a shadow, I found strength in remembering who I had been before Leo, before Chloe, before this rot of entitlement had set in. I was a man who had built a fortune with his bare hands. I was a husband who had loved Anna so fiercely that her absence still ached in every corner of the house. I was not some disposable relic to be cast aside when inconvenient. And when the phone finally rang 2 weeks later, I answered it with the calm detachment of a man who had already won. Leo's voice was strained, too polite, dripping with the kind of artificial charm I recognized instantly as Chloe's influence. "Dad," he began, "we've been thinking maybe we should talk." The irony nearly made me laugh. After dismissing me, after demanding I vanish from their lives, now suddenly they wanted to talk? But I kept my voice steady, cool, unyielding. "I think you made your position clear, Leo. You wanted space. I've given it to you." There was a pause on the line, a silence thick enough to hear his discomfort through the static. Then Chloe's voice chimed in faintly in the background, sharp and urgent, telling him to insist. He fumbled, tried again. Maybe we just needed time. Let's have dinner." The audacity almost stole my words. They hadn't called on my birthday, hadn't apologized for the cruel text, but now suddenly they wanted dinner. I agreed, not out of eagerness, but out of strategy. If this was to be my revenge, it had to be slow, deliberate, undeniable. A single hammer blow shatters quickly, but the steady tightening of a vice leaves a deeper mark. The night of the dinner, I chose a restaurant that had been Anna's favorite, a quiet place in town where the soft glow of chandeliers seemed to preserve time itself. When they arrived, Leo hugged me awkwardly, stiff as a stranger, while Chloe wore that same polished smile that never reached her eyes. We sat, ordered, made polite small talk, but the undercurrent was obvious. They weren't here out of love or reconciliation. They were here because they had begun to sense something. Perhaps the lawyer's whispers had reached them, or perhaps the slight reduction in their allowance had pricked their comfortable bubble. Chloe leaned forward, her tone syrupy but her eyes sharp. "We hope you're doing well. You know we care about you." I let her words hang in the air before answering, slow and deliberate. "Funny," I said, "because the last message I received from you told me not to reach out, at all." The color drained slightly from Leo's face. Chloe recovered quicker, offering a rehearsed apology about stress, misunderstandings, the pressures of modern life. I listened, not interrupting, my silence forcing them to fill the space with excuses that sounded emptier with every word. The food arrived, but I hardly tasted it. I was studying them, the way Leo's hand twitched nervously on his fork, the way Chloe occasionally placed her hand over his, not with affection but as if guiding a puppet. I realized then that Leo, my son, had become little more than an extension of her ambition. And in that moment, pity left me entirely. I no longer pitied his weakness. I no longer blamed her manipulation. They were both complicit. They had both shown me who they truly were, and I believed them. When the check came, Leo reached for his wallet half-heartedly. clearly expecting me to wave him off as I always had, but I let the silence stretch until he awkwardly handed the waiter his card. It was a small act, but the flicker of discomfort in his eyes told me the lesson had begun. In the weeks that followed, I continued my quiet war. I reduced the stipends I had once provided so generously. I delayed calls when Leo tried to reach me, sometimes answering, sometimes not, reminding him of the fragility of the connection he had once thought unbreakable. I attended events in town, spoke with old friends, reconnected with business partners, made sure word of my estate's changes trickled through the right channels. I wasn't loud, I wasn't cruel, I was deliberate. And soon enough, whispers began circling back to them. Chloe, who had once floated through galas with smug certainty, now wore tension on her perfect smile. Leo, who had once believed his future was secured, now stumbled through conversations with me, unsure of where he stood. And yet, I still gave them chances. I waited to see if humility would bloom, if sincerity would break through the veneer. But it never did. Every word, every gesture, every visit was calculated, strategic, dripping with the hunger for what they thought was theirs. They wanted the fortune, not the father. They wanted the empire, not the man who built it. And the more I saw, the more resolute I became. The storm inside me gathered strength, not to destroy blindly, but to teach. Because revenge, at its finest, is not simply about punishment. It is about revelation. It is about forcing those who have erred to confront the weight of their choices. And Leo and Chloe were about to learn that lesson in full. The weeks slowly turned into months, and like the calm before a storm, everything seemed deceptively still on the surface. Yet beneath that calm, a reckoning was quietly gathering strength. I had watched Leo and Chloe dance around me with their carefully rehearsed politeness, their fake smiles, their transparent attempts to gauge how much of their golden future was still intact. I had given them rope, and they had wrapped themselves in it without even realizing. My revenge was never meant to be cruel. It was meant to be clear. And now, the moment had finally arrived to show them, plainly, undeniably, what they had thrown away. I decided the stage for this revelation would not be a courthouse or some sterile lawyer's office. No, it would be my home. The same house where Leo had grown up, the same house where Anna's laughter had once echoed, the same house that had been filled with warmth and promise. If this was to be the final act, it had to happen where it all began. I sent out invitations to a family gathering. Nothing fancy. Just a warm-sounding message that spoke of reconnecting, of shared memories, of dinner together after too long apart. Leo accepted almost immediately, and I could sense his curiosity bleeding through his text. Chloe took a little longer to respond, likely analyzing every word, but eventually she agreed too. I knew what they were expecting. An emotional olive branch, a reconciliation, perhaps even some assurance that their inheritance remained untouched. They would come smiling, dressed to impress, ready to play their parts. But this time the script would not belong to them. On the evening of the gathering, the house was bathed in a soft golden glow, candles flickering in the hallway, photographs of the past lined carefully along the walls, snapshots of a life built with love, sacrifice, and determination. I stood at the end of the grand hall as they entered, and for a brief moment I saw Leo hesitate, as if the weight of his childhood memories pressed against him. But Chloe was there, as always, her hand on his arm, her smile polished and sharp. She guided him forward like a queen, leading her uncertain pawn. "Dad," Leo greeted awkwardly, leaning in for a hug. I returned it, but it was brief, measured. Chloe kissed the air near my cheek and offered a practiced compliment about the house, as if she hadn't spent years barely tolerating being in it. We sat down to dinner in the grand dining room, the chandelier casting delicate shadows across the table. I had spared no expense on the meal. Roast lamb, Anna's favorite wine, fresh bread still warm from the oven. They mistook the effort for sentimentality. I watched their guarded expressions slowly relax as the evening went on. Chloe complimented the food. Leo shared small talk about work, carefully avoiding any real emotion. But beneath the surface they were waiting. They thought this dinner was the prelude to me softening, to me reassuring them that their future remained secure. And when dessert was served, I finally decided to begin. I rose from my chair slowly, the weight of age and intention in every movement, and tapped my glass gently. The soft chime silenced the room. Leo and Chloe looked up, expectant. "I wanted tonight," I began, my voice calm, measured, carrying through the room like the low rumble of distant thunder, "to be about truth, about family, and about legacy." Leo shifted uncomfortably. Chloe's smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened. I walked slowly to the large wooden cabinet against the wall and retrieved a leather folder. Inside were the documents, the revised trust, the scholarship foundations, the letters to be read after my passing. I placed the folder on the table between us like a judge laying out evidence. "For a long time," I continued, "I believed that love alone would hold this family together. I believed that generosity would be enough to inspire gratitude. I was wrong." The air in the room thickened. Chloe straightened, her smile fading just slightly. Leo's eyes darted from me to the folder and back again. I spoke not with anger, but with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose. On my 69th birthday, I received a message from my son. 2 sentences, cold, dismissive, final, and a like from his wife. That message changed everything. Leo's face flushed crimson. Chloe opened her mouth to interject, but I raised a hand and she fell silent. "You both believed that my kindness would last forever, that my silence meant weakness, that my love meant you could treat me however you wished without consequence. But kindness without respect is invisible, and silence does not mean surrender." I opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table. "These," I said evenly, "are the legal changes to my estate. The fortune that once would have been yours, $30 million, has been redirected. Charitable trusts, scholarships, foundations in your mother's name. It will go to people who will value it. People who will never take it for granted. What's left for you," I looked directly at Leo now, "is a fraction. Enough to live, but not enough to coast. Enough to remind you every day of what could have been." Chloe's face lost its color. Leo stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "You can't do this," Chloe whispered, her voice shaking with anger disguised as disbelief. I turned to her slowly. "I already have." The room fell silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Leo tried to speak, stammering half-formed protests, but the weight of the moment crushed his words. I could see the realization dawning on him, not just of the money lost, but of the choices that had led him here. His entire life, he had assumed I would be there, a constant, unshakable pillar. He had never imagined a version of reality where that pillar could choose to step back. Chloe, on the other hand, was furious. She leaned forward, eyes blazing, and hissed, "Do you have any idea what you're doing to us?" Her words were sharp, desperate, like a snake striking out of fear. I met her gaze steadily. "Yes," I said. "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing." Leo stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "Dad, please," he said, and for the first time in a long time I heard something real in his voice. Not entitlement, not rehearsed charm, but fear. "We didn't mean it. It was just a stupid message. Chloe was upset, I was tired. Please, we can fix this." I felt a pang deep inside, because this was my son standing before me, stripped of all his pretenses. But then I remembered the years of neglect, the cold smiles, the texts that cut deeper than any knife. "Leo," I said softly, "I gave you decades to fix this. You chose not to. You had every chance to build a bridge, and you burned it instead." The confrontation stretched on, voices rising, emotions spilling out like a dam finally breaking. Chloe tried to manipulate, to twist my words, but I stayed calm, unmoved. Leo begged, pleaded, alternating between anger and sorrow. And through it all, I stood firm, not out of cruelty, but out of love for the truth. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to face the consequences of their own actions. By the time they left that night, the air was thick with unspoken finality. Chloe stormed out first, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. Leo lingered a moment longer, his eyes glistening, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." And for a heartbeat, I almost faltered. But then I nodded slowly. Not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. "I hope one day you truly mean that," I said quietly. When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in the silence of the house once more. But this silence was different. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of betrayal. It was the quiet of closure, of boundaries finally drawn, of legacy reclaimed. The storm had broken, and I was still standing, not as a bitter old man, but as someone who finally chose respect over being taken for granted. Leo and Chloe would face the world they had shaped with their choices, and maybe someday, Leo would understand. Maybe he would rebuild himself without the crutch of my fortune. Maybe he wouldn't. But either way, my story would not be defined by their disrespect. It would be defined by my decision to stand tall when they expected me to kneel. If this story moved you, if you believe that respect and family values matter more than entitlement, then don't leave without supporting our community. Subscribe to Relative Revenge. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, like this video, to help it reach more people, and comment below to share your thoughts. I read every comment, and your voice matters here.